For this exercise, you need to set up a still life. Basically, just take objects that you like and make sure the light is coming from one direction. And first, you're gonna draw the still life, and don't stress too much over how the shapes look, because I mean, they should resemble the still life, but don't worry if they're like super accurate or no, and like the proportions and stuff will just come later, like as you make more and more. So just try to make the composition interesting, and then yeah, basically just arrange the objects on the table and then arrange them on your piece of paper, and basically draw the shapes, and make sure you not only draw the shapes of the objects, but like the shapes in between the objects. So the shapes that are created by objects being close together, or like a hole. Basically think of it as a hole in a donut, and if you drew a hole in a donut and then a donut around it, it will be the same thing as if you just drew the donut. But for this, it makes it easier, especially if you have like plants or something very complicated. It's much easier to draw the interval shapes than focusing on the trying to like put all the branches or all the leaves in it. So here you can see I'm just drawing the big shapes and kind of like abstracting them a little bit, so I'm not like really worried. Just make sure you don't use the eraser too much, because it does kind of mess with the properties of the watercolor paper. So then I'm just going with like a few colors that I picked. Like I picked two, red and yellow, and then I'm starting with the yellow because it's lighter, and it's usually easier to start with the lightest and then seeing where that goes. And try looking at your still life instead of just like what color is which object. Instead look at it as where's the light and where's darkness. And also for this exercise, you can mix colors to create like a new color as like a middle in between like light and dark. So for me, I prefer to start using one color and then color in like a few shapes that are that color, and then like pick another one and then do something else. Or basically you just like feel it out, and you can start. It's kind of hard to start, so you should start with like something you like most. So for me it was a lemon, and I was like, okay, now when I got that, how is everything else in relationship to it? And so the side of this bowl was like really dark, so I picked the dark red, and then I'm using that. And also higher contrast is gonna bring the object forward. So here, by using very dark red on the edge of this bowl, I'm making it like be closer to the viewer, and then I'm using like a less dark, like a lighter red on like the sides of it, so it appears like it's further away, creating perspective. So basically I'm just trying to not focus too much on finishing one side of the painting or one object of the painting, and I'm trying to work on the whole page at the same time by adding marks to all parts of it. So okay, I'm like working on the dark bowl, then I'm working on the dark side of the pot with the plant, and then I'm switching colors up as I go, and then I also go back and forth while everything is drying, so then I don't have to wait. And I think that's a really good technique, because that way you can evaluate as you go things that like depend on each other. So some things like you can compare them, oh, this is darker than that, but this is lighter than this, and then you can see like how to paint them better, because if you focus only on painting one thing, and then it might turn out that it's not the same, it's not the correct value for like the other things that you paint later on. So it's just working on the whole painting at the same time. And for this exercise, like, try to implement some techniques that we learned from the warm-ups. So here I'm on the lemon, I was using some wet on wet, and then also one thing I really enjoy using in my watercolors, I leave a gap of white because I like to paint fast. So in order to avoid colors to bleed, I leave white, but also it serves as kind of like an outline, and the weight of the outline also creates perspective. So if the line is really big, it kind of brings the object forward, and then if the line is kind of smaller, if there's no gap in between the colors, then it kind of is further away. And for this exercise, it's like really abstract, kind of just based on looking at something, but you don't have to make it look exactly like that. And like, we're not using the same colors, so the shapes are also kind of like very simplified, and just to help guide you to like exploring the paint better, and also using those techniques that we learned. And the most important part of this is seeing. So for most people, for when they're not trained to see, it's very hard to see the perspective correctly, and a lot of people tend to like tilt it, or not notice different shapes in between. And just make sure you look at the object and the shapes in between them. So here I'm like painting, instead of painting the plant, I'm painting what is behind the plant first. So that's what I'm talking about with when I'm saying negative spaces. So here you can see it's like coming together, even though I haven't even started painting the plant itself yet. So I think it's really like fun to watch. But yeah, just use the objects that you really like, because I think these ones kind of inspired me, so that's why I picked them. And then the composition that I arranged kind of went together really well. Also be patient and wait for stuff to dry. If you think some technique would work better, if you don't want to leave gaps between the white, just wait for it to dry. Or if you want to layer something, you have to wait for it to dry. And like, that's the hardest part with watercolor, because it is way faster than oil, but it is still very like gentle, so you don't want to lift up the previous coat or layer, and you don't want to make it bleed if your goal is to layer. So patience is like the hardest for me, definitely. But maybe you're the opposite and you like watching it dry, and like that's cool. But I like to watch it bleed and everything, so I use a lot of wet on wet techniques. And you can go over something you already painted if you find out that it's not the correct value. Here I fixed that thing that bled by taking the brush and drying it, and then rolling it. I can't scrub it because then it will ruin the paper, but if you gently roll it over the spot that you need to fix, then it will lift up the color. And you can use a little more water to make sure it's like nice and lifts up easily without having to scrub it, because that will ruin the paper, and then you can paint over it. But yeah, here I'm using Q-tip to also do that, and you have to roll it very gently, and then it lifts only where you roll it, so it's really convenient. It's very hard to make yourself stop painting when you're super into it, but make sure you stop a little bit before you feel like you're done, because you don't want to overwork it.